Kia ora, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We've got another exciting lineup. I'm so glad you could come and join us. I'm so glad that our guests could come and join us. So welcome. My name's Chris. I'll be hosting the session tonight. And I'll just be sharing a quick introduction to get us started before we jump straight into our speakers, because I know we're all very excited to see all of our speakers tonight. A quick introduction to Aotearoa COVID Action. So we're people from all walks of life who believe that it's our responsibility to work together in ensuring a healthy and safe community for everyone. Some quick ground rules tonight. We will have comments open. I apologize, we did not last time, but I think we figured out what we did wrong last time. And so there will be space for you to comment. There'll also be a Q&A section as well. If you go down to the bottom of your Zoom screen, there should be an option to open up Q&A. Feel free to post questions anytime, and we'll hold those until we get to the Q&A section at the end for the speakers. You're welcome to use comments as well if you want to share information or other things. Of course, please do keep the comments on topic and respectful, and please make sure that this is a safe space that respects people and their privacy. We're live streaming on YouTube as well. Welcome everyone on YouTube. Please do feel free to take screenshots, post them, post the hashtag Clean Air in Schools. Just one other thing before we get started. This is a safe space for learning. All the information tonight is offered without judgment. Hopefully, as has been the case with many other of our webinars, you're here because someone has invited you along, and maybe you'll learn some stuff tonight that you didn't know before, and that's okay. You know, that's as I say, we just offer this information in the spirit of learning, so that everyone can do what hopefully they feel is the right thing with that information. If you do find yourself, after learning some things tonight, thinking to yourself, wow, I had no idea about how serious COVID is or the precautions that we should be taking, I would encourage you to go to our website, and I'll share a link at the end, but it's events.covidaction.nz. Go there and check out our past webinars, which have great advice from some people who are doing things in school and making who are doing things in their school to make sure that it's well ventilated. As I say, you can find lots of information in those places. All right. So before we get started, I'm going to start off with a quick trivia question tonight, just to lighten the mood a little bit before we get in, maybe only a little bit. Feel free to post your answer in the comments. As well, if you're on YouTube as well, feel free to post your answer there. Wondering if you would be able to rank these 4 groups in order of the air quality that they breathe, from worst to best. So, children in New Zealand classrooms, New Zealand politicians, Belgian pub goers, and pigs. Which of these gets the best and worst air quality? Feel free to post your answers in the chat. And while you're doing that, why do we care about air quality? Probably a lot of you know, but just in case, clean air reduces the amount of virus that's in the air that we can then potentially inhale and get sick from. So it reduces the spread of infections. There's a study linked in the slide there that found that every 1 litre per person per second increase in ventilation. So when you're changing air, it's the amount of air that you're changing in the space. Increasing how much you change by 1 litre per person per second is associated with 5 fewer days of absence in school. So really incredible effects. Some recommendations on changing air. So ACH is air changes per hour, how much the air in a space is changed every hour, or how often it's changed every hour. Higher numbers are better. WHO recommends 6. CDC recently started recommending 5. And Te Maho, as part of the Ministry of Education, recommends 6 for schools. So with that in mind, let's go to the answers. So who gets the cleanest air? Well, starting from least clean, children in New Zealand classrooms, in theory, get 6 air changes per hour. unfortunately, for the vast majority of rooms, that relies on what's called natural ventilation. And anyone who's ever tried to clean a smell from a room on a still day will know that you're not getting 6 air changes per hour just by cracking a window on those days. Anyone who's tried to clear the air in a room on a cold winter's day will know that the room quickly gets cold and people start shutting doors and windows. And one of our community recently asked the Ministry of Education for information on whether they're checking whether spaces are actually getting that kind of ventilation when they're naturally ventilated. And the answer, unfortunately, was no, they're not checking it at all. They're not tracking it. So in theory, 6 air changes an hour. In reality, most classrooms we don't know, unfortunately. So after that, pigs get between 4 to 8 air changes an hour. They sometimes get many more depending on the temperature, but that's kind of the minimum that you're looking at. Belgian bars, around 6.3, and New Zealand Parliament chambers get 8.4 air changes per hour, again, thanks to someone in the community emailing them and asking what is the air changes in that space. I was certainly surprised when I learned this information, maybe you were as well. But anyway, that's enough of that, and onwards with our speakers. So tonight we're talking about health and change, or how we talk about health and how we talk about change with others. Obviously, nothing in life is guaranteed. There are no surefire ways to move your school community or move the people that you want to move, whether it's people at your workplace or wherever. But everyone here tonight is going to be sharing things that they've learned along the way about communicating science, about persuading people at their school. No silver bullets here, but we certainly hope this will help you. Sorry, I thought I'd passed all this. As I said, go back to events.covidaction.nz if you want to catch our previous webinars. And now let's jump into our speakers. Dr. Deepti Gurdasani, Cynthia Charron, and Dr. Joel Rindelaub. And we'll be going in reverse order of those. And then we'll have some Q&A and some tips for taking action afterwards. So stick around after the Q&A. All right, let's jump straight into Dr. Joel Rindelaub. He is a science communicator and aerosol chemist at the University of Auckland, whom the New Zealand Herald tagged as the new face of COVID. His research investigates the chemistry related to air quality and health, and he is a regular contributor to media platforms across the motu. Dr. Joel Rindelaub, thank you so much for coming. Please take it away.
Yora, thank you for having me, giving me a chance to talk to you about some of my interests as, I guess, an air quality researcher, as well as some of the communication that I have been doing in that space. So, as Chris mentioned, I am a researcher at the University of Auckland. I'm actually moving to the University of Waikato, so that's actually happening in 1 week's time. So I guess I'll technically be representing both universities for this talk. So I'd like to start things off with one bold statement. Teachers, they deserve a lot of credit. Of course, if we paid them more, they wouldn't need it, right? So that's a very timely and silly pun, but something that I think is important because the teachers, especially in schools, deserve more credit than they get, and especially in their desires and the work that they do to try to make a safe learning environment. So just a little bit of background about myself and how I guess, got into this science communication space. I've tried to make science fun because I think science is fun. And so a bit of a persona that I have is more of like a party scientist, if that's even a thing. So this video that I'm showing on this slide is Hillary Berry just asking me, what are we supposed to do now that, bars and clubs are opened up? How can we still stay safe? So this is me doing my best demonstration to show how you can still party with a mask on. So my, I guess, angle when it comes to science and science communication is to do something that I guess you wouldn't expect a scientist to do, because there's a lot of stereotypes about what scientists are, what they do, and the kind of people that they are. So the idea is to try to just break barriers so you can do something that might have legs or reach a new audience. Even if it may seem a little bit of silly or crazy, the idea is to just have fun with it, because if you're having fun, then your message will go along with the way. So that is the idea behind some of these quotes or antics, or just how I like to approach science in general. So again, a background, research fellow, currently at the University of Auckland, but I will be at the University of Waikato starting next week. And my area of interest are aerosols. So aerosols are basically particles or liquid suspended in the atmosphere. This is, of course, outdoor and indoor. So we know, of course, that we breathe in oxygen, right? So those are the gases. So most of the air that we breathe is actually nitrogen. And but these are the gases. These are just like single molecules floating in the air. But what I am interested in are the particles. So like the little tiny bits of dust floating around that could be so small that you might not even be able to see it. So here are just some examples of different types of aerosols. We have like this sandstorm. Maybe there's going to be some mist above a forest, sea spray. So these little jets and bubbles and other things coming off a breaking wave are aerosols. And then this might be something from a volcano. So anytime you see a smoke or a dust, those are just aerosol particles, or a collection of them moving about. So in the science world, if we actually zoom in on these individual particles under a microscope, we can actually see they have very different sizes, very different shapes, and of course, very different chemical compositions. And especially when we were talking about things like COVID, this is where we can get our viruses entrained into these aerosols as well. So some of the research I do has been looking at a wide range of just general air quality, from things like microplastics to other things such as fireworks and other emissions. And the reason why I care about air quality research is because of just the massive amount of health impacts associated with them. So it may not surprise you that things like lung cancer or heart disease are associated with air quality, but we're finding out that it also impacts cognitive thinking and cognitive development as well. So for instance, if you live near a motorway, you are going to have an increased risk for developing dementia. And it may also cause reduced intelligence levels, because again, it can affect that developing brain. So just in New Zealand, there's over 3,300 deaths per year related to poor air quality. And that's more than road deaths, diabetes, melanoma, and colon cancer combined. So you can see why I'm so interested in this topic. And of course, it's not just outdoor air quality, but indoor air quality as well, which is, of course, a major theme for these webinars. So again, there's gases in the air, and then there's also those aerosol particles as well, which we've all accustomed to, familiar to seeing this kind of photo with just the aerosols that you might see from a sneeze. And again, breathing in that oxygen and breathing out CO2 or carbon dioxide. So again, as we're all familiar with by now, the virus, the coronavirus, is going to be hanging out in these particulate matter, in these little particles, and then which someone else can breathe in and then become infected. So when we're thinking about it, we're basically just breathing in someone else's spit droplets, microscopic spit droplets, which is kind of gross. But I mean, so is a virus that will replicate ad nauseum in your body as well. So clean air matters. As as you've seen from the previous slides. But looking at the US, when they developed the Clean Air Act, what they actually found is that the benefits outweighed the costs 10 to 1, massively. So in the US, what they found is that for every dollar they spent to develop these regulations to make sure that we have clean air, the savings they got were tenfold. And of course, that means more days with employees at work, a more productive workforce, less healthcare related costs. And since the Clean Air Act has been instituted in the US, they've actually saved trillions of US dollars just from these parameters right here. And of course, it's not just outdoor air quality, but as again, a theme with a lot of these presentations that you have surely discussed previously, but indoor air quality is extremely important. And it's not actually just with COVID itself, but poor air quality actually impacts cognitive thinking. So there have found from studies in the US that schools that had the good ventilation have higher test scores for students on math and reading by 15%. So that's a full letter grade better just because they have good ventilation or better air quality. And this again relates to less absent days and lower dropout rates as well. So beyond COVID itself, indoor air quality is extremely important, and especially when you have something where thinking or critical thinking is involved, creativity, learning, as well as developing brains in that classroom. So air quality is, again, something that we are very interested in, and something that I, again, am actively researching. But how you do it does have an impact. So this is, you may remember this from 2020. This is a restaurant where they were showing a super spreader event where this person with the yellow filled circle was COVID positive, and they ended up giving it to all these other red circles. This was in a restaurant. So this is the top down view. Pretend you're a disco ball. You're just looking down at all the tables, and each of these are people. So they did have like a fan going with this air conditioner system, but since there wasn't a crack in like a door or a window, there was really no place for this air to go. So it basically just circulated through this area and ended up infecting all these different people. So how you approach ventilation, of course, very important. And here's kind of what that looked like from a modeling study where you see this blue haze would be the recirculated aerosols compared to somewhere else on the other side of the restaurant that did not get infected just because of the airflow patterns. So an example here from a New Zealand classroom, this was done by NIWA, where they were looking at CO2. So remember, when you breathe out, it's not just particles, but CO2 as well. And so when the day starts, you can see there's high levels of CO2. This red line, basically, that's 1,000 ppm of CO2. That's kind of where you're really going to start to see some noticeable changes in performance from in the classroom, that is. And so you can see throughout the day, it's very much higher than what we would want. And so you can see these little drops here. That's actually when there might be a change over from classes or going out for a lunch period. So basically, what you can do is you can flush out these classrooms where you can take a break maybe every hour to get some airflow back into the classroom. So ideally, the communication that we want to keep talking about is improving mechanical ventilation in these classrooms. Supplemental, you could use air filtration units, but it's not something that we can really rely on. You would basically, the mathematics behind it, we would need a lot of these air filtration units. And yes, they do work. In fact, they do work really well in those closed areas, but sometimes there's just practical limitations like noise, for instance, but they can be used effectively. And of course, masks also correlate with a reduction in transmission of COVID. But in an absence of the perfect world, cracking open like a window and a door or two doors is important, because instead of getting that recirculation, you can actually get an airflow through that can carry that clean air into that enclosed space. Clear the room like on an hourly basis to again flush out that dirty air. And you can use those CO2 monitors, which again, CO2 is a gas, so it's not, that's not where the virus particles are contained. It's within the aerosols, but it's a good proxy for how well ventilated an area is. So that's just a background, I guess, on my research focuses, my interests, and obviously we can see how important it is, especially when it does come to things like transmission of COVID. So I'll give a little bit of background of how I developed my communication style in this area and how it got to me today, where I am talking to you via the computers about science communication. So back in 2017 is when I really started, I guess, my journey. I started to just do some freelance writing, talking about even things back in 2019 about vaccines or climate change, where I also wrote for some pop culture magazines in the US. So there's a bit of a background to develop to try to, test out different communication styles to see what would be the most readable, what would be the most engaging type of material. Follow that up with a lot of primary school outreach as well. And then in 2018 is when I made my debut on-screen appearance for 7 Sharp, where I was called a whiz-bangologist talking about the air pollution from fireworks. So if it looks like I just kind of rolled out of bed in this photo, it's because I pretty much actually did. As things work in the media, they basically will call you up and say, all right, we'll have a camera crew there in 45 minutes. Will you be ready to talk to them? And so basically, you just got to go for it. And so that was the first time that I had the experience of trying to relay, I guess, scientific information. And at this point, I was basically just trying to make sure I didn't say the wrong thing. That was all that was going through in my head. Just make sure I didn't say the wrong thing, get through it, and then go on. But that slowly developed into, I guess, a much more comfortable style of communication. So in 2019, we had the Sky City Fire, Convention Center Fire here in Tamakimakodro. And so that's when I started to clean up the look a little bit, clean up some of the messaging that I was getting onto. And then by 2020, you can see, just based on this picture alone, I have cleaned things up precipitously since my original appearance. And so this is a bit of a metaphor, I think, about cleaning up your message, cleaning up exactly what you want to get across, and being able to distill a complex message down and make it crisp and snappy. So that was, I guess, what I learned just doing more and more of this type of engagement. So then when COVID happened, what happened is I decided to get even more involved with things like YouTube, started to, again, talk about things like aerosol transmission on various news outlets, and then became, I guess, a source on indoor air quality. And so this is where, again, I stopped trying to say the wrong thing and just started to have more fun with the communication, trying to say things in maybe a different way that are maybe a little bit more visual, to try to better engage that audience, help build a bridge between the experts and just the general public. So in one instance, as I mentioned before, we're basically spitting in each other's mouth. That's what aerosol transmission is in a very crude sense. I also had to mention that dry humping is not a COVID-friendly activity. Didn't think I was going to ever have to say that, but that's what happens, or that's what happened at one point. So again, the idea here, when it came to dealing with the media or trying to get the message across, is there's so many great things, especially as a scientist, that you want to say. There's so many useful bits of information, but the hardest part I found was being able to, again, distill that down into 1 or 2 sentences and make it quotable, make it something that people want to share, because again, that will help get your message out even further. Again, so then I decided to try, again, new mediums and ways to just reach new audiences. I made a music video with Susie Wiles and Juliette Gerard. We're fantastic scientists themselves, and the idea, again, was to promote vaccination. So through all this, there's been a few different types of mediums that I've been using, but the real idea here is really important to know your audience, because like you're going to, in a classroom, if you're a teacher, you're going to talk to your students much different than how you would approach, say, the principal. So, and the same concept is with whatever type of communication you're doing, you want to be able to address it specifically to them. That is very important. So one thing that you might have to do is try to identify your audience. And that, again, might not be super straightforward depending on what you're trying to say or what you're trying to change. But again, that could be things like politicians or school boards, or you might have to approach, or parents even, you might have to approach each of those communication streams in a different way. So that was something that I found very important. And again, stick to your message. So this, again, is to reiterate, if there's a lot of different things that you want to do or you want to say, the hardest part, again, is to try to, again, make sure that it's something just straightforward, 1 or 2 sentences. What is the main point of whatever your interaction is with your audience? So that, again, is something that any communicator is going to be constantly developing, is being able to stick to your message, maybe be able to say it in different ways to get that across as best you can. So another terrible pun here related to that. What did the pencil sharpener say to the pencil? Stop going in circles and get to the point. So that's it. That was stick to your message. Another thing that I found helpful was to be excited, because if you're not excited about your message, like who else is going to be? And so excitement and having fun are kind of ways to, again, help reach out and be able to connect with your audience. Because if you think it's really important, show it. You always want to be able to show it. And even if you think you're going over the top, like on camera or your audience, like it's you can always go a little bit further, especially when you're talking about subjects that are traditionally and can be kind of dry to certain audiences, like science and ventilation in general, which isn't traditionally a super sexy topic, but we can still make it fun. So again, be excited. Of course, it depends on what your message is. Like if you are a scientist that needs to analyze like a tragedy or something, you obviously want to have a different type of persona. But again, that again goes to knowing your audience. Another good piece of advice is go for it. If you have an idea, if you have something that you want to do, you want to try, just go for it. Like whether it's making your own videos or doing some writing yourself, the more you do it, the better you're going to get at it, and the more you can develop and hone in on your message and how you can get it across. So I can't recommend it enough. If you want to get your message across, just keep trying different ways, different mediums, just go for it. Networking, again, can be very important. So these are a series of different appearances that I had made. They kind of all fed off each other. And this again goes with the idea of go for it, because once you have something out there, then you can always build off of that as well. And when you are trying to do make large change, networking and having other people that can help you out, that you can have strength in numbers, is of course very important. So networking is important. And again, finally, just have fun, be yourself, because it's sometimes hard to get your message across when it's just the message. But if you can make it personal, put a face to it, make it something that your audience can relate to, that can really help get your message across even better, because you again have helped build that bridge with your audience. So I'll just end it right there with another terrible pun, that I am in my element. Chemistry, woo!
Thank you, Joel. Some great tips there about being yourself, networking, finding friends. That's exactly what we're going to talk about later on. Thanks so much for coming along tonight, Joel. And I can see there's some questions already. Okay, next up we have Cynthia Charron. So Cynthia is a former biology teacher and is a mum to 3 teens. As a school parent, she has worked to engage schools to solve problems and get positive results for students. And I'm sure lots of people have questions for Cynthia about engaging schools. So thank you so much for joining us tonight, Cynthia.
Kia ora. Thank you, Chris. I'm really happy to be here. So Chris, can we just make sure, have you got my slides? Can you see those slides?
I can't see them yet, no. Have you clicked share screen on your Zoom?
Yes, let me just get that back up. There
Oh,
we
wait,
go.
I think it's coming now. My connection might be a little bit slow. I can see them up now. Okay,
great. Kia ora, everyone. My name is Cynthia Charron. I'm really happy to be here. So when the organizers were planning this webinar, they sort of put out the call, is there anyone out there who's ever been able to persuade or encourage the Board of Trustees at their school to make some kind of change, any kind of change? And I think those accounts were a bit few and far between from the people who were out there. And I put my hand up and said, yeah, I have, but it was really minor. It was a long time ago, but I'm happy to share my story. So a little bit about me. I am a former high school biology teacher in New Zealand. And after doing that and moving towns, I was then a senior tutor in cell biology and biochemistry at Massey University. And since then, when my husband and I had our kids, circumstances have just given me the privilege of a lot of time at home. And so as the kids have gone through their schooling and got older, I've been able to use the time that I have to, in various different ways, get some good results for kids at school. That's my kids and other people's kids. So I've sort of over time become a bit of an advocate of sorts. I am a giver of feedback, and that's both really good feedback. If I think there are things really great happening at school, I try to let people know that, teachers and the leadership teams that are involved. But I've also become comfortable in sharing difficult feedback, and sometimes am that parent who has the hard discussions. So I guess because of my background, I'm really comfortable in schools and around school environments. I'm quite comfortable talking to teachers and school leaders. And I'll acknowledge off the bat, that really helps a lot when it's an environment that you're comfortable in. It can sometimes make those difficult conversations much easier to have. And when the goal is getting good results for kids, that can make a big difference. So I don't have an easy fix here for you to go to your schools and get the action you might want for COVID safety. But over the years, I have picked up quite a few lessons, things that have worked and not worked when I've been advocating for change in schools. And I'll share some of the ups and downs that I've had more recently in trying to persuade the kids' current school to have some COVID safety action as well. So I really hope there's something in here that you can use in your advocacy in your schools. So I'll just start with a quote. It is a paraphrase quote that was said to me by a former school leader. I happened to run into them out and about, and he said this to me: "The frustrating thing about dealing with you was that you always came with really good and reasonable points. Schools can't argue against reasonable points, so they have to deflect." And that's not to sort of skate around anything, but when there are hard decisions decisions to be made or hard discussions to have, sometimes schools just are in a difficult spot. And doing the right thing or the best thing isn't always the easy thing. So for parents, if you have an issue or a problem, that can be really difficult to take. It can be frustrating. If it's something really important, it can create a loss of goodwill. It can also make relationships that you've built up with the school a bit difficult. But I think in this case, talking about COVID safety, I think a key is to find sort of the easiest point at which responsibility for health and safety in the school either isn't or can't be deflected, and that as a team, the parents and the school can help work together to bring about positive change, and in this case, COVID safety action. But I think it's important that we don't underestimate the really difficult position that schools are in when we talk about COVID safety. And there is no doubt that schools are in an incredibly difficult position of being given the responsibility of each school on their own. That's something for you to deal with, right? The ministry has given that responsibility over to schools. But it is important. It's the health and safety of our kids and their teachers. And so it's important to have these conversations. So I guess a few things that I've, over the years, come to understand about advocating, whether it's for your kids or other people's kids at school, is if it matters to you, it probably matters to other parents too. And not everyone has the time or the confidence or the ability to speak up on these things that matter. And so if you have the ability and the skills to do it, I think you should, because you never know how many other people you can positively impact with your advocacy. And the complaining at the school gate, it might help get things off your chest, but that's not going to get any positive action with the school. So, you really do need to have real conversations with the school and work together as a team. The school is your community and it's your kids' community. And really, that's the best way to get things done. So relationships do smooth the way. They help you get things done, things you're advocating for can help you get decisions made. And that's relationships with the teachers, the senior leadership team, the administration staff, caretakers, other parents, you name it, Board of Trustee members. This is all about people at the end of the day. And so you need to, if you can, build those relationships and be able to call on those, if and when you need some support. Again, I think we really need to not gloss over the fact that school staff are overworked. They're slogging their guts out, and they are in a difficult position. And, all the school staff and teachers that I've ever dealt with, these are good people, and they are doing the best they can. I mean, we all are. You might have disagreements with some of them. You might not always like the way things are done. And sometimes they can be big disagreements. But, I believe these are good people. We're all doing our best. But, the reality is we can have very strong disagreements on, matters such as COVID safety in schools. And it's important. And so it's worth having hard discussions if they need to be had. So things that I've advocated for over the years, really little things, really big things. One has been my own kids' learning needs, and whether that's for academic extension or academic support for a particular learning disability. And, that's something that's been ongoing over the years. That's sort of a never-ending sort of advocacy. And little things like making sure that younger students can eat inside on freezing cold days. Asking the caretaker to lower the hooks in the cloakroom because the really little kids just weren't able to hang up their bags and get their things. Some of these are minor logistics, but having relationships with lots of different people in the school means that the right people to go to get whatever the positive action that you need. Other things I've advocated for over the year is a child being bullied, other families in times of family crisis. Schools don't always know what's happening for families, and sometimes families really need support. And in a few situations, I've been able to sort of, be a bridge and make the school aware of situations and help the school, help the family get the kind of support they need. So, that's been a really valuable and rewarding thing to be able to do, and, absolutely happy to do it. And of course, more recently, I've been a big voice, that parent sometimes, trying to get particular COVID safety measures either put in place or asking to have things put back in place and just not forgotten about, to be honest, as the situation has changed over time. So my sort of gut feeling is that a lot of these things are probably easier at either smaller schools or even primary schools where parents are on the school grounds a lot more than they are certainly at a high school, for example, and even an intermediate school. And so if there's more regular engagement between parents and the school staff day to day, a lot of these things can just be a bit smoother, just purely based on the fact that you can get to know the school staff a bit better over time, and they also get to know your family. But that doesn't mean that at high school, they're still not your kids, right? And there are still important things that you may need to discuss with the school, and COVID safety is certainly one of those. And I would say, don't give up. And Joel touched on this as well. If there's something that's important to you, keep going. Don't give up. If it's important, and it's really important, don't let obstacles get in your way. If a decision doesn't go your way, dust yourself off and, maybe try again in a different way to advocate for what you're hoping for. School people, they want the best for their communities, and people who have joined the Board of Trustees at their school, they're wanting to do good things as well. So it's kind of where policy of schools and governance of a school needs to meet action, and this is where COVID safety and advocacy for other things kind of meet each other. So the situation that I talked with the organizers about, the very small change that I managed to convince a Board of Trustees to do, was a very small change which required a very large effort, as it turned out. So the problem at the primary school, and it was also a known issue in the winter, there were cold kids in the school uniform. Kids weren't taking their fleeces off inside because they were cold. There was a little bit of an issue of the school not really being sure about whether they were happy with kids wearing their own, puffy coats in the winter, that sort of thing. And so there was a solution. Hey, can we add a merino jersey to the school uniform? And that was to add, not replace the fleece, just to add an optional item, not even as a required item. And I thought this will be easy. There's a clear problem. I found a new local merino farmer family who were growing the sheep, using the merino wool and manufacturing school jerseys that they were supplying to schools in the local area. So I thought, This won't be difficult at all. Well, it took over a year and 2 requests to the Board of Trustees to get merino jerseys added as an optional item to the school uniform. I didn't think it needed to be that hard, but there were a lot of factors at play that, I probably didn't appreciate the first time I tried. So why did I fail the first time? Well, I had this idea. I did a little bit of investigating, had found this supplier, and I just left the approach to someone else. In that case, it was the principal. I took the idea to them. So what do you think of this? And would you be able to go talk to the board? Of course, the board was responsible for the school uniform. So I really was leaving the decision makers, the Board of Trustees, to do all the thinking about this, all the investigating of cost and all of those logistics. And so it was rejected. There was one line in the Board of Trustees report that it was declined. And I didn't know why. Maybe they had other priorities. Maybe they didn't think it was a big deal. Maybe the principal didn't really support it as much as I thought. So time passed and I thought, right, I'm going to try again. So the second time I actually made up a presentation and presented that to the board myself. So I did all the researching and homework that needed to be done. I contacted the supplier. I got samples of the jersey in the right color, wrote up some costings, and presented a bit of a pro and con analysis of the status quo versus adding these merino jerseys to the uniform. I presented it as it was. Really, it was a benefit for the students, and really there was no good reason not to approve it. It wasn't controversial. Really, there was no great difficulty in approving it. So, and in the end, the school ended up going with the current uniform supplier, and it was added to the uniform. So, there were some lessons there for me about doing as much of the grunt work, if you like, to make it easy for the decision makers. So the second time it worked, but it was a lot of effort for a small change, and that was a big lesson. So, fast forward to the last year or so and COVID safety. So this has been a much bigger challenge. Obviously the stakes are higher and it's a difficult position for schools to be in. They've been left with the responsibility for this. Not just the school that my kids are at or the school that your kids are at. This is a very common situation up and down the country, really, that particularly since the removal of the mask mandate, COVID protection seems to have completely disappeared from many, many schools. And of course, COVID hasn't disappeared. So what have I done over the last year? I'd say I've telephoned the principal, I've emailed, I've at times begged the principal, please, can we have some COVID protections back in the school, or when they were in the school, can we have them strengthened, or can we have them expanded to this situation? Maybe because of my background being a biology teacher, I always have liked to keep up on the research of COVID, of the science of COVID. So I like to think I have certainly a good layperson's understanding. We also have someone who's at high risk of poor outcomes if they contract COVID. They're medically a high-risk person. So this is very immediate for us. And, pretty scary as well. The risk of bringing COVID home from school, and it's been well established that COVID spreads in schools, and schools will know this, of course. So this is, this is an immediate concern for us and for me. So over the last year, particularly last year, I would email particular head of departments if there was something at the school, and particularly in that time last year when schools were kind of working out, how do we manage COVID at the school? How do we put in place the guidelines and requirements versus running assessments, offering the opportunities of the school, all of these quite difficult situations to manage. So sometimes I would email heads of department for something happening within their department to try and get an understanding of where they were at and how things could be improved or changed, or to gain maximum COVID safety at the school. At one point, I floated the idea of buying HEPA filters to the parent-teacher group who had quite a healthy balance. And I thought, well, what a great idea would that be if a whole bunch of HEPA filters could be purchased with that money. That didn't really go anywhere. And of course, as restrictions were removed through the year, and I know lots of people will have heard lots of different reasons from different schools of why mitigations wouldn't be put back. We're following the Ministry of Education guidelines. We don't agree that that's high risk. There's an awful lot of parent pushback on things that the ministry isn't mandating. That was a real problem for schools. And whether that was parents complaining about mask wearing or teachers repeatedly having to say to students, put your mask on, etc. It was hard. It was exhausting for teachers on top of a job that was already exhausting, and for principals as well. There's massive pressure and responsibility on the shoulders of principals, but also the responsibility for health and safety at the school lies with the principals and the board. It's a difficult situation, but again, it's important. And so I kept pushing and persevering. At one point, I would email some links to recent research papers saying, touching on some of the things that Joel was mentioning, it's airborne, it's in the air, the windows aren't open. I know it's cold, but can we not have HEPA filters? Things like that. I even in term 4 sent in, you may be familiar with David Hood's risk recent cast and doubling time graphs. You may have seen those by age group. David works the daily numbers from the Ministry of Health. What is the chance that in 100 people, someone in your age bracket, in your area of New Zealand will be infectious? And what is the doubling time? So at a period of time where for high school students, the incidence of COVID was increasing and increasing very quickly in our area, I sent that in and said, please, for prize givings, for example, can we have a requirement to wear masks? Or even just, can you say to parents, there are cases on the rise at school, would be a good idea if you wore a mask. And, I didn't get a lot of positive response to most of these things. I've asked for, suggested a range of COVID precautions and mitigations for school trips and high-risk events. Some of these things worked early on, particularly when schools were figuring this all out. But again, as mitigations have been removed by ministries, my efforts have fallen flat, actually. And I'll be really honest and say that that's been extremely difficult and really stressful. And I know that there are parents at schools up and down the country who have had very similar experiences, and it's pretty tough. It's pretty tough worrying about your kids catching COVID at school, bringing it home, and catching it, repeatedly with no mitigations in place. So it's a real concern. So very recently, I thought I have got to try something else here. I need to be a bit brave here, actually, and I need to take a bit of a stronger stance with the people who've got both the power and the responsibility for health and safety at the school, and that's the Board of Trustees, of course. So I did send a letter of complaint to the school, and coincidentally enough, on a Friday morning, I sat down to do an editing of that letter of complaint, and literally as I was about to sit down and do that, one of our kids tested positive for COVID, which because we have a high-risk member at home, that kicked off a bit of a flurry of COVID safety precautions here at home. And to my great embarrassment, when I was preparing the slides for this talk and doing a school name redacted version of my letter of complaint, which I'll share with you here, school name is removed because, to be honest, it's not about this particular school. This would be a similar kind of response in lots and lots of schools in New Zealand. So I realized to my horror that I'd made a really sloppy editing error, and it completely mangled some of the language in my email. But, you know, I suddenly had other priorities and I just hit the send button. So I sent a letter of complaint to the board, and I tried to use some of the lessons that I learned over time of keeping my goal in mind. And my goal, as it has been all along, was to ensure that COVID safety was treated as a priority for students, for staff, and for all of their families. So I filed a complaint because I don't feel that the school was removing or reducing the risk of illness, COVID, but other respiratory illnesses. And I linked that to the school's policy on health and the health and safety at work legislation. Because that's where, you know, the policy has to meet responsibility and action. And I couldn't see where these things were happening. And so I sent this in good faith, actually, because I needed to have an understanding for my own peace of mind, and to be honest, for my own sanity, that something that was so important as health and safety at school was actually being looked at and not forgotten as if it was 2019. So I added a statement here that the Ministry of Education has been telling parents each school will have its own COVID safety plan, including layers of preventative measures. So I asked the school for a copy of the COVID safety plan. Now, I know some schools no longer have those on the website. Some schools have quite outdated COVID safety plans on their websites. So that's, you know, problematic in a different kind of way. And I did ask a number of questions here, basically saying, what is the plan for COVID safety at the school? How many HEPA filters? Are there COVID carbon dioxide monitors? Is there a system for checking those and monitoring those? Is there a trigger point for reintroducing masks? Why doesn't the school reinforce the Ministry of Health's strong recommendations for mask wearing in crowded, poorly ventilated places, etc.? How can the board ensure that up-to-date and accurate science understanding is used to make these decisions? These are quite genuine questions that I had and that I still have, because I think these things are important. You know, COVID hasn't gone away. And I'm really looking for a way here to be able to understand the school's position or point of view, and what's leading to the decision-making on COVID safety. It's really important. And, you know, if you've watched the earlier webinars in this series, you'll know that there are schools who are taking really strong steps now, even now, to make sure that clean air and COVID mitigations are still happening and are still a priority for their schools. So I did also mention that, of course, reducing COVID transmission is going to reduce illness. It'll reduce disruption to learning, which is a big problem. And it'll also allow for equitable participation in school activities. It's really disheartening. Whether you have a medically vulnerable family member or a financially vulnerable family, you cannot afford to get sick from COVID. It's very disheartening, you know, to be told, well, if these activities that the school is running aren't safe enough for you, or you don't feel they're COVID safe enough for you, you don't have to attend. And I find that very difficult to reconcile, actually, because school events and activities should be safe for everyone. And so I did ask that these questions in this letter be tabled at the board meeting. Unfortunately, by the time the meeting came around, we had a second child test positive for COVID, and they were quite unwell. There was no chance of me making that meeting. So I did receive a response from the board. I'll be very honest and tell you I was not at all happy with that response. It was very brief, basically said we're satisfied or confident we're meeting our responsibilities. They didn't talk about any of my questions. That was all not addressed. So I will not give up. This is too important. This issue isn't going away. And I believe, you know, these are good people at the school who are in a difficult position. And I just think it's too important for me to say, hey, look, I tried and I'm done. I'm not done. And I'm still looking for a way to work with the school. And I encourage you to find a way to work with your schools to find some understanding, find a common way forward to either implement or reinstate or strengthen you know, COVID safety measures. And I really encourage you, if you haven't already seen them, to look back and to share the previous two webinars in this series there's a lot of great information out there, that your schools might find really useful and supportive to have. So what are my next steps? Well, I'm not giving up. These steps sort of go from low conflict, if you like. I don't like conflict or confrontation. Some of these are easy. One of these I've already done. I've sent links to the previous webinars to some members of our school leadership team. I want to know if the school is willing to form a strategy going forward. We cannot pretend that this has gone away. I know people in other schools who have had the same kind of a process, have done things like requested the elements of a school's response that gives the Board of Trustees confidence in its policies, if they're following them or their procedures. I know that some people have gone on to file Official Information Act requests for their school's policies, and whether that's notifying parents of cases in the school or other things. And you can link that to the school's own policies on health or equity, or even their education outside the classroom trips and things. What COVID safety measures are put in place for those? Throwing some hand grenades now at the bottom of this list. This is really ratcheting things up. Filing a complaint to the Ministry of Ed or the Office of the Ombudsman. Someone has suggested at one point to someone else of going to the media. Are those hand grenades I am wanting to throw into the arena? No, they are not. But I know that for some people in their schools, they have not met with any willingness to engage or discuss or to find a way forward. And that's really hard. And so what I'm hoping is that I and all of you can find a way forward with these lower level, much more positive strategies for moving forward. So I would just say, when you're trying to persuade the decision makers at your school, focus on your goal of good outcomes for kids and their teachers. I think we've probably all seen the statistics that in this country and in others, teachers have the highest rates of COVID infections. It is an occupational hazard at this time. We want to keep everyone safe. Take your message to the people who have both the power and the responsibility to make change. In this case, this is the Board of Trustees and the principal. Do any homework that you can. People are busy. We're all busy. Also, you don't know what's happening in other people's lives, and also what other things that could be happening at the school that is taking up a lot of their time and effort as well. So do what you can to help smooth the way. Clearly identify the problem that you're talking about and offer suggestions for the solution if and when you can. And if required, refer back to the school's own policies and link the action that you're hoping for to the responsibility that they have. And of course, this would be much easier for schools if the Ministry of Education would take the reins and just regulate and fully fund clean air action, quality respirators for everyone. But, here we are. This is the very difficult position that schools and families are put in. So I'll just leave you with this quote that another one of my kids' teachers said to me once a long time ago: keep pushing them. And this was not COVID related, by the way. We need parents like you to ask the hard questions. It can be hard to be that parent, right? This is not comfortable. I don't like having had these conversations with the school. It can be very uncomfortable, extremely stressful, and also for my kids too. They don't love the fact that, their mom has had some unhappy conversations with the school. Sticking your neck out is hard, and it can take some real courage. And I have been feeling the stress of that leading up to this, but it's really important, I think, to remember your goal
Cynthia.
is to get positive results for your kids. So good luck, everyone.
Sorry, Cynthia. I need to jump in there. Sorry to cut you off.
No, that's it. I'm done. Thanks, Chris.
Everyone. Thank you so much. I'll move right along to Dr. Deepti Gurdasani. Dr. Deepti Gurdasani is a clinical epidemiologist and a lecturer at Queen Mary University of London. She has written and been vocal about COVID-19, including how it has impacted schools in the UK, long COVID, and how the pandemic has been mishandled. She is a co-founder of the John Snow Memorandum, which seeks to counter COVID-19 misinformation. Cynthia, if you could stop sharing your screen, please. And Dr. Gurdasani, if you could unmute your video and your, there you are, and your audio. We can't hear you at the moment.
Sorry, it says I'm unable to start video because the host has stopped it.
Oh, let me try and turn on your video. There we go. You might be able to try now.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, thanks for inviting me to talk about this. I'm here to talk about lessons on children COVID policy within the UK. And there's a lot to go over, but I didn't want to go into too much detail. What I wanted to really stress was the myths around children and COVID transmission that have originated in the UK, and the policy based on that originated in the UK, and I think then spread to many, many other countries, including, unfortunately, New Zealand. So I thought I would speak a little bit to the myths around this area and how they've ultimately contributed to harming children and communities. So, early on, maybe many people don't remember this now because it's really well established, but there was this thinking that schools didn't drive transmission, children didn't get infected. It's actually been very, very clear since 2020, multiple studies that were published in flagship journals actually showed that school openings and school closures were one of the strongest determinants of pandemic growth. So I think we all become familiar with the reproduction number R, which tells us on average how many people one person is expected to infect. And what many, many studies showed is that when you compare different interventions, school openings and closures had one of the biggest impacts on pandemic growth. We were also told that children weren't susceptible to infection the same way that adults were, and they were less likely to get infected. Unfortunately, this myth sort of arose from lack of understanding of infection in children. So, for example, we know that infection in children is far more likely to be asymptomatic than in adults. So a lot of the infections early on were missed because testing was very much based on symptoms. And even when children got symptoms, often their symptoms weren't typical in the way adult symptoms were. Children often presented with things like vomiting and diarrhea, which weren't picked up as COVID. So studies that didn't regularly test children, regardless of their symptoms, which is most studies, weren't picking up these children. And when you compare infection rates based on children coming forward for testing versus actual infection rates in the community, when you just do random sampling, you find a massive difference in prevalence. So when you do test children regularly, which actually we had a program to do within the UK. So the UK had this community survey that took place every week across a fairly large population to actually determine how many people in different age groups were infected, regardless of whether people came forward for testing. And when you look at this, for example, if you look at children, which is the dark blue line, and the light green line, what you see is, that they generally had high rates of infection. And you can see, for example, during the Alpha wave, the Delta wave, and the Omicron wave, children actually had the highest rate of infection across all age groups, which would be very, very hard to understand if children weren't susceptible to infection, which is what we were told. Now, let's look at how this correlates with schools opening or closing. So here, I wanted to highlight when schools open. So you see this pattern of infection in children. And here children are the red line and the orange line. Whenever schools opened, what you tended to see was that infection would rise. It would rise first in children. You can see that here very, very clearly. And then rise in other age groups. So what you saw was an initial rise in children followed by, and you can see that very clearly here, an increase in the adult or parent population followed by other age groups. And you also saw the opposite pattern when school breaks happen. So you can see school breaks here shown in blue. And you can see whenever there was a school break, infection rates dropped. And what you saw was a drop in children, followed by a drop in adults. And you saw this in the UK. I don't know if you have half terms in New Zealand, but in the UK, we have a break in the middle of term, which just lasts a week. And every single half term, you could see exactly the same pattern. And you saw a clear pattern where the drops first happen in children. So this is the red and orange lines, and then were followed by changes in other age groups. So again, showing that infection children is not reflective of infection community, rather schools drive infection in the community. So once again, the other way to look at this is rather than looking at children, looking at parents. And there are very, very large studies done in the US, done in Denmark, done in the UK that show that parents or household members who live with children have a higher risk of infection compared to people who don't live with children. And not only did these studies show that, they actually showed that the more mitigation measures you had within school, the more likely your infection rate would reduce to baseline compared to people who weren't living with children. And there was a clear dose response that was based on the number of mitigation measures. So again, similar work in the UK, very large study of 12 million adults in England that showed high risk of infection and hospitalizations in parents living with children. And then we were told that transmission doesn't happen within school walls. It happens at the school gate or outside the school. But there are many, many genetic studies now that are able to actually track infection by looking at virus spread. And what they show consistently is that children are silent spreaders. So if you don't do regular testing in schools and you just look at children who become sick, you miss a lot of infection, and you might come away thinking that there isn't a lot of transmission happening in schools. But if you do testing regularly, what you see is that there's silent transmission that happens in children who tend to remain asymptomatic, and infection is often detected when an adult gets infected. The other thing that we were told was, once children get infected, it protects them longer term. You don't really need vaccination. Infection is better than vaccination. UK was one of the countries where I feel children were perhaps most exposed to infection because it had very, very little medications. And this is just to show the proportion of infections that were reinfections across different age groups. And what you see here is that at every point, almost every point in time, you see that reinfection rates were pretty high in children, and higher than in adults. And perhaps you see another peak around the parental age group. So reinfections were not rare in children. In fact, if you look in Feb this year, reinfection rates in children were hitting around 60%. So imagine that 60% of your daily infections were reinfections in this age group. And again, when you look at the Office for National Statistics data, which is the regular testing data of children, you see the same pattern. So if you look at the cumulative incidence, so how many children were infected in each wave, if you take the base down to 0, of course, this should be stacked on top of each other rather than the base starting from 0, you see very, very high rates of infection, particularly during the Delta and Omicron wave, So for example, here you see that 60% of children were infected during the Omicron wave, about 40% of children were infected during the Delta wave. And you can see that essentially by probably April 2022, almost all children in the UK had been exposed to infection at least once. But you can see that even after that, infection has continued in the form of reinfection. So reinfections in children are unfortunately very common. But we were told that none of this mattered because ultimately, even if children could get infected and could transmit, they weren't impacted by COVID because COVID was mild. So this is just looking at data in the UK. And currently we have data that shows that within the UK, there are about 59,000 children estimated to be having been living with long COVID symptoms for 3 months or more. And of those, the vast majority have had symptoms more than a year. So for them, it's very likely to have been a debilitating disease. Now, if you look at the number of deaths, if you look at the annual deaths from COVID, so these are deaths in 2022, you will see that they exceed annual deaths from pretty much every other infectious disease individually. And of course, the impacts on children isn't just the impacts to them. It also depends on the impacts on families. So we know, for example, in the UK, an estimated 16,000 children may have been orphaned, and this estimate is 7.6 million globally. And of course, there's been mass educational disruption because of COVID. And this is not just the UK data. If you look at the US data, there are two things you see. One, you see that there's a U-shaped pattern of mortality or deaths in children and young people. And these are deaths from COVID, not deaths with COVID. And this is all the more paradoxical given these are the age groups we are least likely to vaccinate in many countries. The other thing that I want to point out is the idea that when the vast majority of children were exposed, or during the Omicron era, the severity of COVID would decline in children. You know, perhaps the severity per infection may have declined, but the level of infection has been so high during the Omicron era that if you look at the number of deaths, you don't really see a decline during the Omicron era at all. What you see actually during early Omicron was an increase. And then you see the level of deaths in children have pretty much remained the same as during the early pandemic, or potentially even higher. So we don't see a decrease in severity as we've been told. And if you compare COVID to other infectious diseases, and this is data from the US, you see it ranks number 1 in respiratory and infectious causes of deaths, even compared to things like influenza and pneumonia. The other thing that isn't shown here, but we found, was that if you compare COVID as a cause of death to historical deaths from infectious diseases before vaccines were available for them, for example, diseases like measles, the number of deaths from COVID every year actually are higher than the number of deaths from measles before vaccination was in place, which was around 500 or so. So even from that perspective, it's puzzling that so little focus has been put on vaccinating children from COVID when we don't think twice about vaccinating children against measles. Now, unfortunately, death isn't the only bad outcome in children. This is no longer thought of as an acute disease. For many people, this is a chronic disease. And we were told long COVID, again, was not worrying in children because they recover quickly and they develop long COVID rarely. Unfortunately, this hasn't turned out to be true either. So this is results from the CLOCK study in the UK, which looked at children who tested positive for COVID, followed them up at 3 months and 6 months, and assessed many different symptoms. And I'm just going to point out one of these, right? Because, I know there's a lot of controversy around these studies, but let's look at a very, very specific symptom of COVID, which is loss of smell. And what you see here is that if you look at children at 3 months, about 15% of them had loss of smell, and at 6 months, about 10% of them had loss of smell, compared to almost nobody in the COVID negative group. And I just want to point out that this is just one symptom. There are many, many others here that you can see. You see huge differences between the COVID positive and negative group. But even loss of smell in 10% of children at 6 months, compared to almost none in a COVID negative group, is a debilitating symptom. And what you see here is that many symptoms persist. It's not like you see them at 3 months and then they're gone at 6 months. Many of them actually show very little recovery between 3 and 6 months. And that's really concerning. And it's not just symptoms, right? So COVID also increases the risk of multiple diseases. So we know, for example, the study that came out from the CDC showed an increase in lung clotting, increase in heart inflammation, increase in renal failure, increase in diabetes among children and adolescents, which is again worrying and is very similar to what we see in adults. But then we were told, okay, fine, now that children have been exposed, it's over, because reinfections in children will be much milder. So they will not have the same risk of long COVID. They will not have the same risk of hospitalization. Unfortunately, that also doesn't seem to be necessarily the case. This is a study that was published in The Lancet, for example, that showed that among children who did get reinfection, the hospitalization rate of their first infection was quite similar to the hospitalization rate of their second infection. And similarly with long COVID, in this study that was recently published with, caveats and limitations of this study, it showed that persistent symptoms were similarly common among people who had their children who had their first infection and their second infection, and in both cases, far more common in those that didn't have COVID. But despite knowing about all these impacts, if you compare the vaccination rates in children, so for example, this is 0 to 4 years, which is pretty much 0%. This is in Europe. The median rate in 5 to 9 years is around 14%, 10 to 14 years is around 37%. You compare that with adults, and you can see that the vaccination rate in children has been abysmal. And part of that is this idea that children are somehow immune to COVID and vaccination doesn't really benefit them. What about COVID mitigations, though? Things like, social distancing, mask wearing. And, we had school closures during 2020, which had their own harms. But if you look at their impacts on respiratory disease was massively reduced during that period. So this is a paper in the BMJ that shows you huge decreases in multiple respiratory conditions. I mean, influenza pneumonia was almost eliminated during this period, particularly in children. So, but surely, countries like the UK, who didn't have very much in the way of mitigations, at least must have done better in terms of attendance because, they didn't see the same drops in attendance because of isolation, because they gave up on isolation really early on. Unfortunately, even that isn't the case. So despite removal of all mitigations in schools, there has been a continuing rise in school absences, almost as if the rise in school absences was never related to the mitigations, but rather to COVID itself. So to summarize, I think the lessons that we learn from the UK are that disinformation and doubt has really undermined the response to COVID in schools, not just in the UK, but in other countries as well, which unfortunately took their lead from the UK. But the scientific evidence actually has been fairly clear since 2020, despite the claims of uncertainty around this. Children have always played an important role in transmission. Schools have played an important role in transmission. Children are impacted in multiple ways. Impacts on their health, impacts on their education, impacts of carers getting ill. And these impacts are also unequal in our society, being far more for families who are vulnerable, families who are poor and disadvantaged, ethnic minorities. And mitigations work. So it's really unfortunate that children are continuing to be impacted when we have mitigations like air filtration, ventilation, masks that do work, and vaccines that do protect. But boosters are needed, even in children, as they're needed in adults. Unfortunately, boosters are not available to children in most countries. So why have children been left behind? I always kind of end with this because, this is, to me, the ideal of making schools safe, because I see that as the only way to really protect children who have, I think, been really left behind in this pandemic, as have clinically vulnerable families. That's all I have. So thank you for letting me share today. I'm just going to stop.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Dr. Gurdasani, and thank you to all our speakers tonight. I'm conscious that we're close to time, so I want to jump straight into some questions. And I also appreciate some of our speakers have to go right away. If you have time for one question, Dr. Gurdasani, I was wondering there's a question here. Someone asked, why do you think there is so much resistance to vaccinating kids?
That's a tough one to answer. I mean, it's ideological, or that's what it seems like to me. I think in the UK for a long time, there has been this thinking that infection is good for children. It actually precedes COVID, because in the UK, I don't know how it is in New Zealand, but in the UK, chickenpox vaccination is not available as part of the national program to children, because the idea was that it was good for children to get exposed to chickenpox. And while other countries move to introduce the chickenpox vaccines, the vaccine committee within the UK at that point didn't, because they thought it would increase the rate of shingles. Actually, what's happened is probably the opposite in countries that have vaccination for chickenpox. But despite about a decade of experience across the world, this hasn't changed what's done in the UK. So I think it's ideology within the UK that I think has spread across the world, except in some silos. Like the US Academy of Pediatrics has been very good throughout, but I can't really understand beyond ideology, because it doesn't really benefit anybody not vaccinating children, you know.
Thank you. Do you have time for one more question, Dr. Gurdasani?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, I'm happy to stay.
We've also got a question here asking, would the vaccine be a benefit now that we are living in a constant environment of multiple variants of COVID? It's so hard to decide. This person is said to go for bivalence, mRNA, etc.
Yeah, it's a very hard question to answer. I mean, what I would say is it is hard to know. And while vaccines that are different from the variant that you're going to be exposed to provide far less protection against maybe transmission and infection protection against severe disease still seems to be considerable. So it seems to be, you know, between 50 to 80% up to 6 months, you know, which I think is reasonably good. So as long as you don't expect that vaccination will stop infection or transmission, and you get vaccinated and boosted regularly in the hope that it will reduce severe disease and maybe to some extent long COVID, I think it's fine if you use it as one single layer. As in what vaccine to take, I think that decision has to be made based on what is your risk of exposure now versus when the next vaccine comes out. And if you're likely to be exposed in the next few months, I probably wouldn't wait, because I think vaccine development is unfortunately always going to lag behind variants, because we're not doing anything to actually reduce the rate of evolution of variants.
Thank you. We've got a good question here that's maybe a question for all of the speakers, so everybody feel free to jump in. As I said, I understand if people have to go, we're right on time. What mitigation do you think would give the highest impact and suffer the least pushback?
Okay, so highest impact but maximal pushback, I think, would be everybody wearing a I mean, I know I'm not answering the question you asked, which is a high-grade, well-fitting mask. Highest impact and lowest pushback, I think, would be something related to reconfiguring ventilation and filtration systems, although that is costly, you know, so there is going to be the pushback on that. But in terms of individual freedoms, I don't really see how that massively encroaches on anybody's freedom. But filtration, if you have a high air exchange rate, can have a huge impact on reducing infection.
Can I just add something to that?
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, Joel, I was just going to say, I mean, I would agree with Deepti that, you know, ventilation and filtration would probably have the least amount of pushback, certainly in schools. And we already know that that was a very difficult situation for schools and teachers in particular to manage. But I think it would be really important for schools to also think about, yes, there would be a cost involved in mechanical ventilation, but also maybe compare that to the cost of relief teachers just for last year alone. And, you know, would we be looking at another massive cost for relief teachers again, with teachers being sick this year? And, you know, for how long would this go on? And not to mention the, you know, the benefits also to learning and all the other things of ventilation. I know Joel can obviously speak to that better than I can, but.
Yeah, basically, just to add to what Cynthia said, ventilation needs to be improved in New Zealand, and especially in the classrooms. It has some of the worst classroom ventilation anywhere. And so it's not just necessarily a COVID thing, because politically that might not have so much traction now, but you can frame it in so many other ways. Like we're literally making ourselves dumber by having poor air quality.
Thank you, everybody. I'm conscious that we're 1 minute past time. I know, Dr. Deepti Gurdasani, you have an appointment to get to, so I don't want to keep you any longer. I really want to thank you for your time. it's all right, I might impose for 1 minute, one more question on our other two speakers. I've got a question here for Dr. Joel Rindelaub. Wondering if you could say a little bit about science communication and disinformation.
So disinformation, misinformation is very difficult to address, especially since it comes from so many different angles that you're basically playing whack-a-mole, it feels like sometimes. And oftentimes that is a strategy of disinformation, to just put so many different things out there that it's really, difficult to keep that message clear. So there is definitely a very important role for, I guess, experts to be able to have a place where they can communicate their expertise in a trusted environment. And I think it's something that, of course, if you look around the world, that we're still struggling with today, but something that we need to keep improving on, and we need more experts to throw their hat in the ring and to help out with the problem.
Thank you. I might just throw in there as well. In one of our previous webinars, Justine talked about values-based conversations, and one of the big learnings there is really not focusing on the things you want to disprove. The more time you spend trying to disprove those things, the more time people spend thinking about those things. So you really want to move over to the things that you can agree on and the things that are true. Could I, there's a question for Cynthia. What if I can't find anyone in my school community who cares?
Jeepers, I mean, it's really hard. I mean, I wish I had an easy answer for that. Yeah. I would say, I wonder if you might know of people that actually you possibly don't realize it. And again, it depends on maybe the age level of your school. If it's a primary school, you might spend more time chatting with other parents. You might see a family who's wearing masks on a regular basis. I know our family does anytime we're out in public. Those are things to maybe watch for. Even just having a really honest and heartfelt chat with, say, your child's teacher, or if you're at high school, maybe they're a dean or head of school. I'm struggling with this. Who at the school can I talk to? Because you don't always know who the best person is if you don't already have those relationships at a school. So I've always found that it's really helpful to say, I just need some help. If you're not the person who can help me, do you know who might be here at the school? And that might be a teacher or a member person on the senior leadership team. It could also be that they know of another family who feels the same way that you do and is having the same struggles. But it might just take a little bit of conversations and a little bit of digging and see if other people can help you identify who those folks might be. But listen, I hear you. It is hard. And I have been told that I am the only parent who has these concerns. I know that's not true. I may well be the only parent who's prepared to be so vocal about it and to keep these questions coming. But I know there are other parents out there. So it might just take a little bit of digging to help you find who your other people are at your school. But listen, good luck. I really wish everyone the best.
Thank you so much. I would again call back to some of our previous webinars where we talk about systematically going through, thinking through everyone who's at your school who might not exactly align with you, but maybe has a shared interest for some reason. Maybe it's like a community group that your school volunteers with that has vulnerable people in that community, for example. It's there's no denying it's been hard for everyone who's facing this. But maybe there's someone you don't know about yet. And also, don't forget that those who speak up in opposition are a vocal minority. They're not. All the research tells us they're not the majority. But it can feel like they are because they're so loud. But don't think that they speak for everyone. I am so grateful to our speakers, and I wish I could keep you for another half hour to talk more and answer more questions, but I want to respect your time. So thank you very much again, Dr. Joel Rindelaub and Cynthia Charron for joining us. I'm going to skip through the usual ending that I do because we're well and truly out of time, but I do just want to share one slide to invite you to our next event, which is the ACA Action Party. You've heard from so many wonderful speakers now, all the different things that we can do. Now, let's get together and support each other as we take action. Is there a letter that you've been thinking of writing to your school, but you're not, you just haven't sat down and got it started? Come along, write it with us on the call. If you're going to be writing to your union, if you want to, there's a friend that you've really wanted to contact and see if you can get their support. If you just want to make that list of people who you think you should at least reach out to because you haven't checked with them yet if they might be supportive, come along, start working through that list, start sending messages. It's a time to get together, to support one another and taking some action. Who knows, we may even find some music because we could all do with a smile, I'm sure. Thank you everyone once again for joining us. And I hope you have a wonderful evening, and I hope we'll see you again on the 20th of June for our action party. See you then.